Judy and I have been doing some work on what constitutes what is an enabling policy environment for local community energy, and then I have sort of pulled into stuff I've done with ECA, and then I've sort of built on from that. So this is just a really brief, nearly like pitch of where I'm at the moment. And I'm also working with someone at Aalborg University in Denmark to do some. Basically, we're detailing how these policies have evolved in 4 countries, and our main question is why. Why are some energy sectors so much more inclusive, so much more democratic, right, than others? So that's perhaps a question for the public this evening that we can stroll about.
We adjusted the camera to like straighten it. So
yep.
Thank you. There, we can see you now.
Cool. All right. Okay, so I'm going to keep this very short. I just quickly wanted to highlight what these look like, right? what they are, and give you some examples of what's happening elsewhere in each of these categories, right? So, starting off with legal frameworks or mutual ownership. Here we're talking about a clear legal definition for local and community energy, right? So we're seeing that, for instance, in the European Union 2019 Clean Energy Package that comes with very clearly defined legal rights for local and community energy. So the CEP states that consumers have equal rights to participation in energy markets as traditional market players do. And it goes on to stipulate that member countries in the EU must put in place an enabling policy framework and must remove technical and administrative barriers for these players to take part in the market. So that's probably the most far-reaching and ambitious, I would say, policy framework that law we have globally for ensuring that we can make these policy changes to enable participation. All right, but there's also other things going on here. We've got, in some countries, we've got suitable tradable entities. So we heard this morning a little bit about some countries using co-ops because they've got good co-op laws. And this is all about finding the right corporate kind of body that enables community organizations to manage these projects and to distribute the benefits to their members in the way that is suitable for their specific context. The other big one is, and of course we see that here with lines companies in New Zealand, but we see it elsewhere all over the world, is that non-profit regulation for monopoly services enables municipal and consumer ownership, and not just of distribution networks, but also of heat supply and retail as well. All right, the second one, of course, is market access, right? Without market access, well, nothing's really going to happen. So here we're thinking about the regulated buyback rates, right? The power purchase tariffs above wholesale prices, but also guarantees for grid connection and power purchase, etc. All right. So next one up here is securing financial viability. Now we all know that new entrants in this sector, especially if you don't have a credit history, right? You will struggle generally to access commercial debt, commercial finance. Right? So that's where that access to finance comes in later as well. But this is really about making sure that projects are actually financially viable. And we've heard a lot this morning, also in Helen Haines' local power plan, and some of the international speakers put forward some example here. Put up an example here about at the moment we've got a phase out in a way in all the countries of these feed-in tariffs, right? These export, these subsidies on capacity and on export for renewable electricity, but we're seeing a new scheme being set up like this German residential subsidy for batteries. Now, up to Scott's favorite topic, regional resource planning and facilitation. So here, of course, we've got local authorities getting very active in terms of removing some of that pre-feasibility work, identifying sites that might be suitable for wind development, for instance, in the municipal wind planning in Denmark, for example. You've got local authorities directly investing, co-investing in projects, but also national programs, often from public bodies like crown entities like the Forestry Commission, for example, with a kind of a route to open up access to that land for projects. Okay, so some of these I think we've already covered, right? Around access to finance, and we've heard this morning this is so key elsewhere as well as here in New Zealand at the moment in terms of what barriers projects are facing. And I think a very interesting one that we heard about from the UK about tax privileges, and you see that back here as well in Denmark, where they have a maximum tax-free income for residential and community renewable energy. All right. Now, one of the things that we've sort of quickly come to realize when we're doing this country comparative work is that if you don't have sort of these 1 to 5 categories in place, then obviously these other categories of policies are not in themselves going to go to work, right? So there's sort of a merit order here, if you like, in terms of importance. All right, so the final one perhaps, and one that might resonate with some of the discussions we've had today around, we're in a situation here where within government, within single agencies, you've got a completely different ideas around the role of local community going forward, and around what that energy transition in New Zealand looks like. And you can sort of overcome a lot of that by pulling your heads together and actually putting out a strategy, right? A national civic energy strategy. So that's potentially something we could work towards, and often that comes in with national targets as well. Okay, so I'll leave it there because we talked about all the other ones already. So we online, zooming in from Wangaratta, we have Dr. Helen Haines, and she's an MP, so she's a very busy person, and I was hoping that we could give her this slot for the next 10-15 minutes and listen to her and talk about her local power plans. And I put a couple of copies of the local power plan at the back on that table for you to have a look at. But let me just first start by introducing Helen. So Helen is an MP, an independent federal member for Indi in Victoria. So we've sort of heard briefly from Jara this morning how CPA and Helen have been working together. She's also a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne in the Department of Rural Health. She's the director of the Rural Health Academic Network and an executive director of education and research at Northeast Health Wangaratta. So that's where she's chiming in from at the moment. She's a strong advocate for climate action and for rural infrastructure and health services within the Australian Parliament. We are thrilled to have you here today, Helen. Are you able to hear us and everything clearly?
I can hear you. I can hear you really clearly. I hope you can hear me too.
We can hear you and see you. Yeah, fantastic.
That's a great start, isn't it?
It is. We had a bit of a panic moment because we had our previous session ran late. So yeah, sorry about that. I'm wondering if you could start us off briefly about telling us about your vision for local and community energy in Australia.
Thank you so much. And I just want to be clear. Are you Anna? I think you might be Anna.
I'm sorry. I always never introduce myself. It's just a thing. Yes, I am. Anna Berka. I work at Massey University. Many of the people in this room will know me from my work with ICA last year and with the University of Auckland prior to that. So I have worked with various people in this room, in different ways.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for the invitation today to this Community Energy Forum. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to join with you virtually across the ditch. It's a thrill for those of us in Victoria and Australia to cast our eyes beyond the state borders, which have only just opened for us on Monday. Can I just acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm coming to you today from the Bangarang people of Northeast Victoria. They are the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm speaking to you today, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present of these lands, and I pay my respects to all of you there in Massey and to all people in New Zealand, and very much appreciate the work that you're doing and the friendship that we share with all of you. So I just want to perhaps correct the record a little bit with my introduction, Anna, and thank you for acknowledging all of those bits of my life, which are now kind of sitting in the chapter before where I find myself now. I was elected to the Australian Federal Parliament about 18 months ago, and now I'm my position at the university is I'm no longer working there and no longer working in healthcare, but all of that past history, of which is close to 40 years, underpins very much my philosophies and my approach to regional development, to the improvement of our opportunities in regional Australia, and by improving the opportunities and access to so many aspects of life, our health will improve too. So it was a very strong motivator coming from a health background to enter Parliament. So I represent the electorate of Indi, which is 29,000 square kilometres in northeast Victoria in Australia. I was elected on a platform of strong action on climate change, and particularly action on community energy, which is rather novel, actually, to be coming into the Parliament with a platform of community energy. Indi has a thriving community energy sector. There's around 100 community energy groups right around the nation of Australia, and 12 of them are here in my electorate. So we have a good understanding in our community about the potential for community energy and the reality of it. So coming into the Parliament, the people of Indi who elected me and the people who were so interested in community energy made it very clear to me that we have no national policy to support community energy. And when I was elected, I spoke to my local groups and realised there wasn't one single reform that could help them reach their potential, and that I needed to work with them to come up with a plan. And as you all know, unless you've got a plan, you cannot make things happen when it comes to policy. So I was really committed, and my background as a rural health academic gave me some understanding of the power of a co-design process when it comes to policy. So my office got together with our community energy groups across Indi. We formed an expert panel of local people. We wrote a discussion paper outlining what we thought were the key barriers and opportunities for community energy in Australia. And we ran an 8-week co-design process, slap bang in the middle of this pandemic. We had detailed workshops with community energy groups right across Indi. We fired up the old Zoom technology and off we went. And we had 2 national workshops in addition to that. We put a call out for submissions to our discussion paper, and we received 100 submissions from across Australia, from companies, from organisations, from community energy groups, and from individuals. So we had a fantastic response. And it became really clear that there were some consistent themes and in the challenges that people face and the policy responses that were needed to really get traction on community energy. And the first was financial. There are some existing grant opportunities in Australia for community energy projects, but we heard loud and clear that they're really piecemeal, they're ad hoc, and groups don't have the ability to plan their projects in the long term. They're essentially waiting for a grant opportunity to come up, and that's not cutting the mustard. The second was about technical capability. And as you know better than me, community energy projects are complex, and most communities lack some of the critical expertise needed to get projects off the ground. The third was about resource sharing, and everyone knew that successful projects exist, but there's no structured way of documenting those successful models and sharing them across the groups. So we're not getting the expertise sharing in a really meaningful and useful way. So was born the local power plan. Working with our expert panel, and Anna, I'm delighted you spread some copies of the local power plan around the room, because we're really pleased with the product that we have. We wrote the local power plan to capture the big opportunities that we believe community energy hold. So the power plan calls for the establishment of a new Commonwealth agency, the Australian Local Power Agency. with an explicit focus on supporting regional communities to develop locally owned renewables. I'm calling this agency ALPA for short, and it would deliver that objective in 3 schemes. The first scheme would establish 50 local power hubs in regional centres right across the country and create a new $310 million fund to seed grant projects from these hubs over 10 years to community groups wanting to develop their own renewable projects. These hubs would have 2 full-time staff, so that if you're a sporting club or a school or a council that wants to install solar or a battery, the hub's there to support you to do that. The second scheme is a public underwriting scheme for mid-scale community energy projects. In Australia, the government has an existing underwriting scheme whereby it guarantees a minimum rate of return to large-scale corporate-owned, mostly gas-fired power stations. So our scheme proposition is that that would be extended in policy to support community-owned, mid-scale, renewable power stations. In Australia, there are a handful of community-scale solar and wind farms, and this underwriting scheme is about driving that sector to scale. And the third scheme is a new requirement for any large-scale renewable projects to offer 20% of the project value to the local community. Australia's building literally dozens of large-scale renewable projects, and while they deliver some benefits to communities, they're mostly to landholders. One project in New South Wales, however, the Sapphire Wind Farm, offered locals the chance to invest. Now the locals own a share of that wind farm, which means they have a stake in it and they earn money. And we know in regional communities the opportunity to diversify income has been limited in recent history, and this is a great way to earn a new source of income. So the local power plan would require all new renewable projects to offer that same investment opportunity with a view to increasing local ownership and support for new large-scale renewable projects. So 3 schemes for small, for mid and for large-scale renewables. So what about the politics and the policy of the local power plan? We really designed the local power plan to be visionary and to be practical. As you probably know, Australia has suffered climate wars for at least a decade. People have been standing in their corners and unable to find their middle ground. And we've got no policies right now in Australia to support community renewables. So the local power plan was conceived not as a climate change policy, but as a regional development policy. It's not about reducing emissions, but it's about building the resilience and creating economic opportunities in the regions. We framed it about self-sufficiency, about independence, opportunity and resilience, precisely to speak in terms that regional communities resonate with. We also designed it to be practically possible within the existing policy framework of the government. And our 3 policy mechanisms are about grants and on-the-ground expertise, an underwriting scheme and a co-investment scheme. And each of these are politically feasible within the Australian federal current policy context. So the government here already administers some grants to community energy projects, but we're calling for that to be done better, to be done in a more organised, systematic and scalable way. And the government already underwrites investment in energy projects, and we're calling for that to be extended to community energy projects. And our country is already installing massive amounts of large-scale renewables, but we're calling for regional communities to have the chance to co-invest. Now, the pushback that I get and the community energy groups get across Australia is that there's an idea out there that community energy is not scalable to meet the emissions reductions task we face. But those criticisms really miss the point. When climate activists conceive of renewables, they think of them as a way to reduce emissions. In Australia, most renewables will be built in the regions. And our experience has shown that when renewable developers don't engage meaningfully with communities and share the benefits of their developments, communities have lower support for renewables, and those projects take longer and cost more. So the local power plan, it doesn't start from the point of stabilising atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. It starts from the point of the communities that will host renewables and asks what those people want for their region. It fits the renewable transition into the communities rather than fitting the communities into a renewable transition. And that's the real power of community energy. It's actually about empowering regional communities in such a way that will lead to a faster and more sustainable renewable transition because everyone has a stake in it. So the local power plan is also not just about small-scale rooftop solar. It also conceives of community energy at the mid-scale and large scale in terms of partnerships with developers. And sure, a 5 megawatt community solar farm does not alone meaningfully reduce Australia's emissions, but 205 megawatt community solar farms across the country becomes a large, clean power source. It brings new income to 200 communities and it builds support for renewable transition in those communities. And that's what community energy is about. So the political challenge lays ahead. I'm drafting legislation right now to establish an Australian local power agency with the powers to implement the local power plan and its 3 schemes. And to make this happen, we ultimately need the Australian government to adopt it, to see the value in it as a policy framework. So our strategy is twofold. As a parliamentarian, I'm meeting with regional MPs across the country to advocate for the local power plan as something that would benefit their communities. And in Australia, as you know, we have a national party who is ostensibly there to represent rural communities. So they're members of the government. So my task is to really help them to see that this is a way of actually pursuing the goals that they might have as regional MPs, just like the goals I have as an independent regional MP. And I'm working with regional communities to advocate themselves to their MPs so that those very same MPs that I'm talking to, that they all understand that it's something that the people want. But perhaps we actually have an additional opportunity ahead. The United States election will put pressure on Australia to beef up its policy commitment. The climate change bill pushed by my fellow independent, Zali Steggall, would set a zero net target by 2050 and is becoming more and more untenable for our government to oppose that target. And this policy, the local power plan policy, is something that they could support without losing face or changing course completely. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm optimistic that we will nudge ahead in a strong and effective way. We have a budget in Australia coming up again in May, and I'm going to be working tirelessly to make sure that we can get recognition of this local power plan and eventually get this policy into legislation. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. So that resonates with a lot of what we've been talking about this morning, the barriers, but also very useful in terms of nearly kind of a menu of policy options that you've put together so comprehensively. And the other thing that strikes me about this is the process in which you've done this, right? Where bottom up meets top down, if you like, which we can really learn from, I think. So thank you very much for your time. If we do have questions that are directed to you, we'll just email them through to you or Hamish, if that's all right.
Thank you so much, Anna. Yeah. I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you. All right. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
Right, so Daniel, he works primarily on renewable energy, but he also does a lot of Resource Management Act stuff. And we've also got Nina. Now, Nina Campbell, I think many of you will know Nina. She's Senior Advisor on Policy Engagement at ICA. Her background is in behavioral science, so she's basically all the human-centered stuff that ICA does, Nina will have something to do with. Nina also has a sort of a keen interest in monitoring and evaluation, so a lot of the stuff we've talked about today around, demonstrating benefits, the need for sort of more systematic way to go about documenting those benefits. Nina will have done some thinking on that. So, and she's worked with the International Energy Agency for 10 years prior to her time at ICA. Right, so I know that this was a bit of a, well, in a way, I want to sort of protect you a little bit from the audience. The Electricity Authority declined to show up today, and I think I've also been told that in our last meeting together, many of you were there, they felt a little bit, what's the word, drilled by us. So, but let me start off with some questions for Daniel, if I may. Sorry, I'll just get them here ahead of me. So, let's start off with the consultation that came out this year on accelerating renewable energy and energy efficiency. I was wondering if you could perhaps share with us what NBIE took away from the responses that came back to that. Of course, most of you will know there was a chapter on community energy, local community energy in there that actually I was part of writing up with you, right? So I don't know where that went, so I'd be really keen to hear more about. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. She's being far too modest. She did a huge report that when she was working at ECA, that partly became the chapter of the discussion paper. So thanks very much for that. So we had a big discussion paper out at the end of last year, which was consulting on a whole bunch of stuff around accelerating renewable energy. There was a chapter on community energy. It took us a wee while to go through the subs because there was about 3,000, but we published a summary of submissions a few months ago, and if people haven't seen that, I'm happy to send the link around because it's a really interesting read. The summary is 50 pages long. It's still quite succinct. I wrote it. It was a big job. It's the first time as a country though we had a conversation across everything, community energy, process heat, the electricity market. So it was a really, really good process for us. But of course then COVID came along and changed the game a wee bit. In terms of the community energy feedback, quite a lot of interest, a lot of community groups submitted, quite a few Maori energy groups submitted. The kind of key messages that came back to us reflecting on the barriers were, I think what people see to be the barriers around community energy very much framed from their personal experience. So we've heard about RMA barriers from Scott, which will reflect what happened down in Blueskin. In other cases, it'll be financial barriers. Where do you get the upfront capital to invest in projects, which is a big barrier for many people. Where do you find $100,000 to build a wind turbine or solar in the first place? Land access barriers in some cases. We've got somebody from the Paikakariki Community Trust here. They're looking to do a development on surplus land from Transmission Gully, but you need to go through the Public Works Act process, which is pretty long and convoluted. But I think a pretty common thread that came up too was a sense that it's actually about the electricity regulatory arrangements that distributed generation has to operate within. So maybe that's what the EA got grilled on last time. I'm not too sure, but this is things like, what does it cost to connect into local networks? What price do you get? What money do you get for selling electricity back into the network? But if it's 5-6 cents a kilowatt hour, that's not very much to justify your return on investment. How should demand response, stuff like that, be priced on networks? So there's a sense that I think some of the really good submissions we saw were saying that community energy and small-scale distributed energy isn't just about solar panels on roofs. It's about how do you actually maximise the value of that from communities. And I guess some of the projects we're seeing out there at the moment, it's not just about solar, it's about storage, it's about sharing energy, it's about microgrids, it's trying to squeeze the most value out of that investment that you can. And we've just had a lot of Maori energy projects talking to us in the last couple of months where it's really, it's about how do they have, sovereignty over the energy use, how do they share excess power with their whānau who can't afford it, how do they make the most of what they're generating so they're not paying money back into the grid that doesn't really maximise its value. So quite a sense that with community energy, it reveals a lot of broader issues around distributed generation, which might not be community projects, might be small ones, but New Zealand's system's really set up to have big generation, to transmit, electricity the length of the country and get it to the edges. It's not really set up in terms of market design, in terms of lots of small-scale stuff at grid edge. And there's no surprise to most of you, I guess. And, there's always a lot of sort of momentum around the status quo. Our whole system's set up to operate in that way. And there's a lot of interest bubbling through in terms of small-scale community projects, but it takes a wee while for the oil tanker to start to turn. Okay? And in terms of what people...
How long though?
I'm not the minister, Anna. This is when Minister Wood would have opened it and promised the world and gone away and made a deal with it. I'll get to that point later, but I think in terms of what people wanted to see, I think there was a sense that having a more coherent approach to community energy strategy would be helpful. But I think what that really meant for me was if you're keen to see more community energy or small-scale generation What does it actually mean in terms of the RMA? What does it mean in terms of how the Electricity Authority manages networks? But I think for me too, like a challenge for our system, you know, something I took away from some of the earlier presentations is every country's energy system is so different, and you need contextual responses. So we've got a market-based system based on competition. We've got 30 odd EDBs, some are community trusts, some are foreign owned. We've got the Commerce Commission that approves what people could spend. We've got the EA. It's quite a complicated system, and it's market-driven, it's competition-based, but a lot of what we're talking about is actually about cooperation. It's about working across silos. How do you design a project that's going to work under the different sort of investment frameworks of 30 different EDBs? How do you set policy in Wellington that applies to like 100 different projects that are all quite different? So I think what we're kind of seeing is a sense that a system that's kind of based around your Ministry of Works approach in the 1950s and build the transmission and build the big hydro, etc. You know, the future of the energy system is going to be a combination of more big stuff maybe, but also a lot more small stuff that really challenges how the system works. And a lot of the calls were saying, well, how do we actually start to shift that system in a way that allows participation of both the big and small? I mean, in terms of the big stuff, you would have heard about the New Zealand battery project, which my team is working on, which is looking at dry air supply, maybe some really big projects like down at Lake Onslow in the South Island. But at the same time, some of that big stuff like more hydro storage means you can bring more renewable energy into the grid because you can buffer the variability of solar and stuff over time. So I think it's trying to think about the big and the small at the same time, which really challenges the way government works, because we're sitting there in Wellington and so is the EA, but we've got so many different stakeholders, so many different projects on the go, etc. Something I'd maybe like to touch on at the end of the session is how we kind of capture some of the learnings and the good news stories and the innovation that's coming out of the sector, because very quickly it gets hard for us to keep up with all of these dozens of different things, but we know that we have to. That was the main stuff out of consultation. It was a really valuable exercise for us, but of course then the world did change a wee bit with COVID.
So where are we at now? What's the next step with Minister Wood, do you think? Is there feeling in terms of the renewable energy support package?
So I mean, I think we've got a continuation of the last government, or the last Labour government, and the last minister. And I think the priorities of this government are really framed around two things: it's decarbonisation of the economy and electricity affordability. Decarbonisation, we can talk a little bit about this. I mean, you would have seen some recent funds announced, like quite a big fund for decarbonisation of process heat. So New Zealand has 80% renewable electricity, but we've got a lot of emissions coming from, you know, industrial processes, steel processing, milk processing. So the question for us is where do you find the capital and the right kind of transmission to convert, say, a whole bunch of South Island dairy factories into electricity or biofuels? That's a $70 million fund that's been set up, and ECA are running that, so Lena might talk to that more if you want to. So there's also the State Sector Decarbonisation Program, funding that's been made available for the likes of schools and hospitals to retire coal boilers. So this is the government trying to show some leadership. Obviously, the work of the Climate Change Commission and the response to that will be, I guess, New Zealand's energy decarbonisation strategy once that arrives. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but that should probably cover all of the sectors of the economy. The other key thing really is affordability. So there was the electricity price review reported like over a year ago now, and there's some work still coming out of that the EA is working on, like changes to wholesale markets in terms of more transparency in terms of how wholesale markets work, phasing out of low fixed charge tariffs, etc. So the EA has quite a big work program in that space. There's also two funds that I've been working adjacent to that people may or may not have heard about, so we can talk about those now if you'd like. You might be interested. First, actually building on the presentation we had before from Bluff and Aotearoa was really interesting. One of the recommendations of the electricity price review was funding for a network of community energy advisors who could actually go out and sort of work at more of a local level in terms of energy literacy, getting people on the right power plans, making sure they can access insulation, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So the government has funded some work in that area, and we're probably hoping to announce next steps in December, mid-December, I'd say.
So it's more than a help desk, they actually go out.
Yeah. I think, you know, somebody talked before about the whānau ora navigators. There's a sense that you actually kind of need to reach into communities in a meaningful way, and you can't do that through a centralised process. So it's kind of like, who do you partner with at a local level who are trusted partners who people are going to listen to and already reach them? Because it's really hard to set up a new program that can kind of reach into people's lives and communities. But what you can try to do is build on trusted relationships. So there might be, you know, additional training to people that are already looking at energy or insulation or whatever and giving them some extra support. The other fund that was announced was a $28 million fund for renewable energy on public housing and Maori housing. So again, we're hoping to announce the next steps around that in December. In a nutshell, what that is, the first part of it is renewable energy on public housing, which is mainly Aotearoa's housing stock. So the idea behind this, and again this was referenced earlier, at the moment people with solar panels on their roofs, and I'm one, we can afford it. The people who probably need it the most can't because of the upfront capital costs. I know the Minister is really keen to see some innovative ways of looking at energy affordability. So this trial is going to be trying things like solar and batteries on state housing basically, to see what can we actually do around people's energy prices when we've actually got installations on roofs. So Aotearoa are working on that. They're working quite hard to identify a first trial. I can't talk about that yet because they haven't finalised it and talked to their tenants. We'll hope to announce that in the next couple of months. That's a really exciting project because we've got 70-odd thousand public houses in New Zealand. It's a lot of roofs. The second half of it is a fund for renewable energy projects on Maori housing. So again, we're just working quite closely with Tony Kokiri and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. They've got quite big Maori housing programs and a lot of networks into the regions in terms of how can we kind of build on those networks, but also some of the housing programs. If we're funding housing repair or the development of papakainga or marae redevelopment, etc., how do we sort of like build into Maori housing the opportunity to also have, say, like small scale local community solar? So what we'll probably do with that is announce expressions of interest for that fund when it goes live. We'll have about $14 million. I think there'll probably be far more projects than there is money, unfortunately, but we've already had, quite a few Māori organisations have heard about it coming forward and talking to us about some of their projects, which are really cool. And the great thing about this is often those communities who most need us, that are at grid edge, say far reaches of the East Cape or Northland, sunny areas, intermittent electricity supply, really high power prices because they're paying a lot for transmission. So it's the opportunity to say, like at a small scale, like let's say it's housing or papakainga, if you have some small scale solar generation and storage, maybe microgrids, can we actually make a real difference to the energy affordability? Because getting them on the right power bill and stuff is all good, it doesn't really shift the dial that much. And I think just last, what we'd really like to see out of this, and this is kind of a challenge back to the industry, but also drawing the kind of expertise that some of this room will have, is we don't want trials and projects that are just about, say, solar on roofs. It's going to be about, let's be innovative, let's think about innovative retail solutions, let's think about peer-to-peer trading, let's think about storage. And there's already some really interesting, I guess, what I call them startups because it's not really fair, some interesting models around, there's, say, Nomaira, Maori Retail Energy Company, who's got quite an interesting model of retailing and sharing energy back to those of their customers who are struggling to afford it. We've got people looking at peer-to-peer trading through retail markets. We've got people looking at, you can own a share of a solar panel, but it's 400 kilometres away, but you own a share of that, you somehow find a way to bring that back to your bill. So I think what we'd really like to see is to use these pilots as a bit of a sandbox for innovation. And I think a lot of your members and what you've been talking about today, some of you are already playing in that space as well. And so that's thinking also as government, how do we kind of bring people together and share good news stories and best practice? Because a small little community group in the middle of nowhere doesn't really know where to start with this stuff. Well, somebody in New Zealand will. So how do we put them in touch with the right people and give the right kind of support to develop good projects? And the last part of that is really good evaluation methodology. To say if we spend, we say $100,000 in this community doing this, this and this, what do their power bills look like a year in? What's the inverter data? What's the smart meter data? Hey, great in summer, but it's better than nothing. Maybe they're saving a couple of $100 a month in a summer. They didn't need to use heating so much then. Maybe they're spending it on shoes or food or rent, So figuring out kind of the wellbeing impacts. Because it's not just about using heating. In some months it's going to be about, I guess, net household income. So we're trying to work with the likes of ECA, who've got an awesome evaluation methodology around warmer Kiwi homes. I've got to say, Nina's leading the work, which is amazing. More than every 10 years though, isn't it? Because the government's got quite a lot of, there's also the Healthy Homes Initiative, there's lots of government stuff in the space. We want to make sure it's all got a common evaluation language so we can kind of share and say to government, you've got the winter energy payment, you've got insulation, you've got solar trials. What's actually the best way? It's probably a combination of those things for different communities. Yeah, exactly.
That's great. That's awesome. In terms of just touching on what some of the things you said, in terms of
taking stock of progress as we go along here, right? As we implement all these new projects all over the place. Do you foresee? Is there a kind of a space here to actually gather some of this data systematically in a way that perhaps we've started to do, building on that going forward, as a way for everyone, not just you, but government, all levels of government, everyone, all the players in this space. Yeah.
I mean, I think that would be great because, government is important, but our activity in the economy is only ever a pretty small proportion of what's happening. So some of the projects that have been spoken about today, if there's learnings and evaluation that we can jointly discuss and we can talk about war stories and pros and cons, and I know, for example, that some people at Indi are working on an updated definition of energy hardship and affordability. But again, that work needs to be sort of factored into the conversations that people out in the communities are having. How different, NGOs thinking about energy hardship. So I think absolutely, maybe that's something we can talk about in terms of the next steps. But
take the chance to jump in. So evaluation, I guess, on this topic is something that's very close to my heart, and actually it's sort of an exciting time for evaluation at the moment, I would say, in the COVID-19 context. We've got a lot of money going out fast. We've got a great opportunity with a mandate or permission, I guess, to really invest in evaluating the impacts of that and doing extra work around linking people up and making sure that we're sharing our methodologies and our approaches, but also gathering data, comparing data, and trying to kind of get a continuous collective learning to support the step change that we need. So Dan's already mentioned the effort that we're starting around energy hardship to create a linked up kind of work program around energy hardship. And then EECA is really active in energy hardship. You know us from our Warm Kiwi Homes program, which is primarily focused around addressing energy hardship and lowering power bills for low-income homes. But we're also looking into community energy. You know that from Anna's work when she was working for EECA. But without a really strong mandate from the Minister for EECA at the moment, we're going to continue to focus on energy hardship. But in the sidelines, definitely thinking about learning as much as we can in the community energy space so that we're well tooled and prepared to respond when a clearer mandate does come through from the ministry. And I think the project, the $28 million solar project for public and Maori housing that Dan mentioned is the opportunity we've been waiting for to get some projects happening on the ground that we can wrap our arms around and gather all the learning, figure out exactly what the challenges are, as well as gathering data that we can feed into the program design for the future and figure out what exactly the support should look like. So it's an exciting time from that perspective, and I think the question about what mechanisms we need to make sure that we're gathering all of that information from all of you out there with individual projects in terms of experience and data needs some thinking about. We've got systems that still need development within government, but how to reach out outside of government where the action is really happening at the moment is the interesting question. So
I've got a solution for you. You're sitting in a room with the network, the community energy network. In actual fact, most of the bigger activities in New Zealand are actually linked to this network. So to find information and gather data, most probably it's all there. It's all in the relationships you've already got with EECA and I suppose with the Ministry for Business. I'm offering a partnership with the energy groups here because I think that this grouping has the same exact motives as government, and not many other groupings in New Zealand, specifically in the energy field, whether it's installation or energy generation, will have exactly the same motives. So iwi is another grouping that will have the same motives, but so there's quite a structure already there. I don't know that you need to go too far to actually tap into and most I utilise these networks to get a lot more data because we're out there dealing with thousands of houses every year, thousands of families every year, and we could get more information that could be valuable by simple add-ons when now people are out there writing out the specs on that home and designing it and questioning the families. There's a whole lot more information that could go into that. So all I'm saying is can leapfrog pretty quickly. And I think the key word is partnership. And I hear government talking about partnerships, and there is some partnerships between government and initiatives, but really, that has got to be the case. That true partnership's about actually working together and going, what's our common goal? How can we utilise the skills of the people involved to get there quicker? So I'm just saying, we're offering that through CEN. I'm sure I can speak for other people. We're here, ready to go, very good structures. We deal with a lot of people. We deal with large projects, so we're very efficient and organised in how we deliver. So what we do is of high value. Anyway, sorry.
Mentioning CEN brings to mind the comment or the discussion we started this morning about the new data that's showing up on CEN's website. And so that sort of opens the door in a way. It seems like an obvious starting point as a platform where your data, your information is already appearing. So maybe that's the way into that partnership. And I totally agree. I think you guys have the expertise and the experience, and you're already organised. So it's the most logical way for us to tap into that conversation, I guess. I love the comment that Helen Haines made about co-design. I think that is what we'd like to see happening, and I guess we as government need to upskill on how that works and how that looks. But as a behavioural scientist, I'm really excited about that idea of preaching to the converted. So hopefully we'll be able to develop some innovative models and get some good conversations going sooner rather than later.
Any other questions? Can I just open this up? I'll bring the mic up for anyone. No questions, come on, you're totally booked out.
There was a question here,
Yeah.
and it was, can we ask about price affordability of lines charges? They're 50% of my bill.
Okay, yeah, so that's an EA question. Scott.
So for Julie, that's your insurance policy to make sure you still have access to electricity all the time. That's the 50% of your bill. I've got a couple of questions. One is, can we have a timeline on a national environmental standard for community wind, please?
Well, actually,
and the other one is, you did mention in the seed fund or the sandbox approach for innovation, and this has been a real difficulty for all of us who are working in that smart energy hardship space with the strength of the incumbency, the structure that we have at the moment, the EA, the EDBs, the power of the 5 main retailers. There is a stamping out of all the innovation at the grid edge, and it is so hard without government support to keep drawing money out of extracting money out of the sector to try and make change happen. I really think you hinted that there might be some resource through for a sandbox, and that's definitely what's needed. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard for me to comment more broadly on the EA's work program. Something though, like with these trials, and I've talked to the EA about this, is with some of these, Maori community energy trials, if there is the opportunity to use those to look at some innovative ways around network pricing and regulation, I think they're happy to have that conversation. I think from what you're on the IPAC, so you'll know more than me, I get a sense that for a long time people have been saying, we need that, let's just try some stuff. It's really hard to change all of New Zealand's regulatory system all at once. Let's try some projects. And if that needs a rule to be bent, can somebody allow that to be bent to see what we can learn through doing? So I think if there's an opportunity to do that, I think we really do want to try that. The broader questions on the EA's work program and priorities, I know they're looking at, there was a project on microgrids, there was a project on pricing of distributed generation and demand response. I can't really speak to it, to be honest, and I'm sorry, but I don't want to put my foot in my mouth and misrepresent their position. With the RMA stuff, so the other thing I forgot to mention was Indi got $3 million in funding to do updated RMA national direction around renewable energy, which is great, because under the current model, the host agency, not MFE, has to do all the work. So our intention was to get that updated and passed within this term of government. The only kicker we have is, as mentioned, the RMA itself looks like it might be replaced by some other stuff, and that might change the system of national direction under which we operate. The Minister for the Environment, David Parker, is working through that stuff, and I'll expect some announcements on next steps before Christmas. But the reason I'm saying that is part of the answer to how do you incentivise investment in renewable energy might be changes to the actual legislation itself as well as national direction. Okay, I won't get too technical on it, but if you think about the purpose and principles of the new RMA, whatever that is, how does that refer to climate change and renewable energy? It might make it stronger. Okay, so the kind of national direction we do will be different under a new act. But like at the moment, just to give you a quick example, under the RMA, renewable energy is ranked in terms of the purpose and principles below freshwater and biodiversity. So it's very strong and hard to have national direction that puts it on an equal footing. If you have new legislation that puts it on an equal footing or refers to it in a different way, you've got more choices.
Okay, so Maria?
So, sorry, this is just a bit of a statement or thoughts that have been happening. So in terms of hydro, so New Zealand talks about being, renewable and it's green and everything else. And for such a long time, I've always thought, we are damming up so much water for hydro. What is the environmental effects on that? I don't think, because it's a different government department that deals with environment and energy, that I don't think we've actually got a good grip on that. And then you've got the farmers that are extracting water and everything else. And what is the long-term environmental effects? I don't know. That's just my comment. I don't know if it's a question or
I'll just take one more question, because I saw you had a question, right? Just before we answer that one.
Thank you. When are we going to recognise the World Health Organisation recommended temperatures for minimum standards for houses, the minimum of 18 degrees or ideally 20 degrees within the building code of existing and new builds? At present, it's 16 degrees for only elderly and early childhood centres, and that's just in the living spaces. Why?
Let me bring into that one. So I think we're generally very strongly accepting the WHO guidance on healthy temperatures in homes. It's just a matter of filtering that into the legislation as it gets reviewed. So right now we've got so I think the Healthy Homes Standards Act is going in that direction for rented properties, and for new builds. The Buildings for Climate Change program is underway now and is having a very strong focus on outcomes, so not just about the energy demand of a particular home, but how is it serving the energy service needs of the occupants. So that's going to be a new angle on how we look at the consent process and certification for new builds, and the new up-to-date evidence about what healthy temperatures are will very much be taken into account. There's no dispute in any of the discussions that I'm involved with across government that 18 degrees is the right number now. So you can rest assured on that one. It's just a matter of, these processes are coming through slowly.
Thank you.
Do you want to comment on the hydro question?
Yeah, briefly. It's a good question. I mean, the environmental cost of the hydro schemes, the big ones when they were built, was huge. And the Lake Maori scheme, sort of triggered a lot of New Zealand's first environmental movements and stuff, and led eventually to the RMA. The challenge with those is those effects are kind of baked in now. They flooded whole valleys and led biodiversity and stuff like that. The challenge now is what we're seeing. We're seeing a clash of values in the run of the river. So we've got a lot of tension in freshwater planning when we've got, say, nitrification of rivers, pressure for, say, hydro generators to release more water into the river to dilute pollution. Then you end up with a very hard choice, between freshwater management versus the value of hydro storage. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any big new hydro on the cards apart from maybe that mooted Lake Onslow scheme, which is being looked at. But I mean, it seems, well, the industry will know more than me. I think you're more likely to see a lot more wind farms and solar than big new hydro schemes like we have in the South Island, would be my guess. Just due to those huge upfront environmental impacts. The main challenge then for New Zealand is wet storage, because the hydro lakes are pretty shallow. And that's a big, dry year risk for New Zealand. Is when you have more and more electricity needs to be managed in some way. And at the moment, nothing apart from hydro can give you that, but who knows what will come in the future.
Can I jump back in again on the healthy homes question, because it just occurred to me that it would be a good opportunity to mention the Waimakiwi Homes evaluation, which was mentioned previously as the sort of source of evidence 10 years ago for everything that we do now, and that's kind of what all of our programs are riding on, and we're very conscious that that's outdated. And what we really want to know is how much warmer and drier are the homes that are getting treated under the program, and specifically dig into questions like what's the actual temperature change inside homes, conscious of the fact that in the lowest income homes, actually some families aren't getting on those heat pumps because they can't afford to run them. So the technology is there, but actually the temperature inside the home hasn't necessarily changed. We know that insulation does trigger some change, but the real cost comes through running heat pumps. So our new evaluation is going to kick off next year. It's not going to dig so much into the health impacts of that temperature change, because we know that's been really well established by the Victoria School of Health Research and that previous evaluation. What we're really going to look at is we're going to directly measure what's happening inside homes, and we're going to look at the behavioural element and the choices that occupants are having to make between spending money on energy bills, spending money on food and education and all the other stuff. And I guess trying to inform ourselves about how to design a program better, even better, that really gets into what people need and the questions they have around how they can control their energy consumption better. So that will give us heaps of new information around temperatures, it'll give us new information around behaviours, and hopefully inform future iterations of the program. So I'm excited about that.